Alcatraz was one of the most fierce, unforgiving penitentiaries of its time, known for the isolated environment, superstitious background, and holding some of the most infamous criminal masterminds of the 1930s. Today we are going to venture deep into the past of this island and find out the history of its inmates as well as their life here in Alcatraz. This penitentiary was known for the intense rules to discipline the notorious inmates. It had a strict and organized timing system to keep them in line. Today, Alcatraz is a place of contradictions, with a grim past and an enduring future as one of San Francisco's most prominent landmarks and tourist attractions.
Perhaps one of the most infamous inmates to ever inhabit Alcatraz was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. He was born in Brooklyn, New York at the turn of the century, and not much is known about his early life up until around age 12. He left school during the 6th grade and almost immediately was pulled into the mob scene. At the age of 18, he had worked his way up the ranks and became an influential lieutenant in the Clissimo mob. In 1925, Capone took control of the Torrio mob in Chicago and built a fearsome reputation for himself as a relentless extortionist. Perhaps one of the most famous acts of violence Capone took part in occurred on February 14, 1929. It was coined the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and occurred when 7 members of the Bugs Moran mob were gunned down against the wall by associates of the Capone mob who were disguised as police officers. Shortly after, in the May of 1929, Alphonse and his bodyguards were arrested for carrying concealed lethal weapons. He ended up serving his 1-year sentence in Cook County Jail and was subsequently released 9 months later. Once again in 1931, Al Capone and a few of his thugs were under investigation by the Department of the Treasury for tax evasion. In October of that year, he was convicted of those crimes and on November 24th was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000 and charged for $7,692 of court costs, in addition to the $215,000 plus interest due on back taxes. He was sent to Alcatraz and served 7 years of his term and was released early in November of 1939 due to health concerns. Immediately afterward, he was rushed to the hospital where he suffered from brain damage that was a result of paresis during his internment. Following his release, he never publicly returned to Chicago or the mob scene. In 1946, his physician and a Baltimore psychiatrist, after examination, both concluded Capone then had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. He passed due to a stroke and pneumonia on January 25, 1947.
Robert Stroud was born on January 28, 1951, in Seattle, Washington. Robert Stroud, who was better known to the public as the Birdman of Alcatraz, was probably the most famous inmate ever to reside on Alcatraz. In 1909, he brutally murdered a bartender who had allegedly failed to pay a prostitute for whom Stroud was pimping in Alaska. Stroud was transferred to Alcatraz, where he spent 17 years. He was still able to continue his research on birds. Stroud sentenced to hang, but President Woodrow Wilson commuted his life sentence to life imprisonment and solitary confinement. Stroud was able to author 2 books on canaries and their diseases. Having raised nearly 300 birds in a cell, carefully studying their habits and psychology, he even developed and marketed medicines for various bird alignments.
Here, as it turned out, they had cut a doorway through one wall of his cell that led into the next one, and that is where it turned out he kept his canaries.
Yes, you ever lie in bed at night and say, I wonder how many men I've killed?
Well, sometime I've counted them up, but I'm not going to tell you.
The next inmate, Alvin Creepy Karpus, was a member of the Barker Karpus gang based out of the Midwestern United States. He received the alias Creepy for his smile and ruthless behavior. Karpus was known for kidnapping wealthy individuals and ransoming them to authorities, and was one of the only 4 individuals to receive the title Public Enemy No. 1. He was found and arrested in New Orleans on the 1st of May 1936. He was the only public enemy to ever be captured alive at the time. During his trial, Karpus was actually able to plead not guilty until he stated that he wanted to plead guilty to his crimes as long as the kidnapping charges were dropped. Out of all the inmates at Alcatraz, Alvin was sentenced to the longest term to serve at 26 years. After Alcatraz closed in 1962, he was transferred to McNeil Island Penitentiary. He was released in 1969 on parole and moved to Spain in 1973. He later passed away on August 26, 1979, aged 72.
After 2 decades of intense scrutiny relating to operating costs and confinement practices, on Thursday, March 21, 1963, the end of an era arrived with the official closure of Alcatraz. Alcatraz will always be remembered as the most fierce penitentiaries of its time.